tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Joining me is a Conservative Member of Parliament and former Conservative leader, Andrew Scheer. Andrew, good to talk to you again.
Good to see you, Andrew.
This. Obviously, this is a pretty rocky few years for the Conservative Party, one could say. You know, you go from successive election losses in 2015, 2019, 2021. You were the leader for one of those periods. The vibe here, though, is really different. I mean, it almost feels like an in-government vibe from the crowd here. I mean, have you sensed this optimism before 2023?
This is an incredible atmosphere right now, and we try not to get too hung up in the polls. They go up and down, but the thing that is just so encouraging is when you look at the number of people that have been coming out to Conservative events. Every delegate I've spoken to, every riding president says, when we do an event now, we're getting people who have never come out, not just to a Conservative Party event, but a political event in general. So Pierre's message of tackling the cost of living crisis that Justin Trudeau has caused by bringing inflation down, lowering interest rates, it's really speaking to the hurt that people are feeling, in addition to the core principles, the Conservative principles that he has stood up for, getting rid of the carbon tax, protecting individual freedom and free speech. So there's a lot of reasons why people are enthusiastic and optimistic.
I mean, I was there in 2019 when you announced your platform, and a lot of the things that the Conservative Party and the Pierre Poilievre are talking about now are things that you were talking about as well. I mean, affordability, balanced budgets. And why is it that you think the message seems to be taking on this new life now that hasn't always been the case?
Well, because the damage that Justin Trudeau is causing has just gotten that much worse. In 2019, interest rates were lower, inflation was lower. Now it's just crippling families. I'm sure you know many friends who are counting down the months to when they have to renew their mortgage.
Yeah.
If you've got friends who are on variable rates, they're already experiencing that pain. So I think the pain is just so much more pronounced. Crime is way up. The scandals have piled up. So just all the things that were there in 2019 are there again here in 2023, just times 10.
And of course, one of the big changes between 2019 and 2023 has been COVID. And if you look at a subset of that, the Freedom Convoy, which for Conservatives, I think was a really big eye-opener. And I've seen shades of that at the convention. I mean, Anna Poilievre in her remarks talked about truckers, which I think got a pretty big standing ovation. We've had Pierre Poilievre talk about that. We've had also a resolution to amend the Constitution that was talking about freedom of association. And I'm wondering what you take of the fact that seems to have really embedded itself in the Conservative consciousness, that moment in Canada.
Well, Pierre spoke to this a little bit too, where he talked about how past governments, whether they were Liberal or Conservative, would still stand up for fundamental freedoms. We might disagree on what government policy should do or how it should be implemented, but that those basic human rights that we as Canadians enjoy, they're under attack in a way that they never have been before. And what we saw when people came to Ottawa to stand up for their freedom, to protect their freedom of choice, there are people from all walks of life, from not just truckers, but there were a lot of small business owners. There are a lot of people who had been fired or lost their job because of a healthcare decision that they wanted to make for themselves. So, there's a lot of areas we can look at to say that Justin Trudeau is eroding our freedom. We've got the internet censorship bill, all kinds of things that he's doing to divide Canadians. But that was maybe a moment where it kind of hit a catalyst moment or had a breaking point, and people decided to stand up and do something about it. We're a ways past that now. So now we're looking at, okay, well, how will a Conservative government stand up for those freedoms? So when I hear Pierre talk about things like repealing C-18, C-11, making sure that there's freedom of speech on campus,
yes.
There's a lot of things that we can do on a go-forward basis to make sure that our fundamental liberties are protected.
I know one of the things that you had proposed that I quite enjoyed in 2019 that I think Conservatives should definitely make a point of is a law constraining governments to balance the budget. Now, you look at the books now, I mean, something like that, you would need to have such a long runway to implement that because of how bad things are. And is there a bit of concern on your part that if the Conservatives do win, and let's say there's a majority government, or there's a 4-year mandate, that it'll be so challenging to disentangle all that Trudeau has done over, by that time, 8 or 10 years in a 4-year term, and that it'll be hard to meet those expectations that Canadians who are hurting may have?
Well, it's a great question because every every month that goes by that Trudeau doesn't bring in a plan to constrain that government spending, to eliminate those deficits over time, is another month where real pain hits Canadians and has long-lasting consequences. So there really is a sense of we're running out of time to fix this before it gets really bad. When Trudeau was promising that interest rates would stay low for a long time, that debt was consequence-free, we were calling him out on that, saying, no, eventually the chickens come home to roost. And now we're seeing that. We're seeing the terrible consequences of runaway inflation. A lot of
this was when we were being told it was transitory. By the way, it's just going to be ship passing in the night, right?
And it's so frustrating to see these economists that work at banks or Bank of Canada officials themselves who were telling those false promises back then now say, well, it's not. It's all kinds of factors. It's global supply that's all nonsense. The Bank of Canada printed hundreds of billions of dollars to buy government bonds to allow Trudeau to continue his massive spending. That's why we're seeing inflation. That's why Canadians are suffering through higher prices. And that's also why now the Bank of Canada has to raise interest rates to make up for their mistakes in the past. So what Pierre was talking about, Pierre was, really the first voice with a large platform to warn Canadians about this. Those same economists were poo-pooing him and saying, no, Justin Trudeau's right. Pierre was right. And had we listened to that common sense plan, and if we just kind of used our common sense thinking as a country, say, wait a second, you can't rack up the credit card forever without someday paying for it, this mess wouldn't be as big as it is now. So in answer to your question about kind of timelines and how bad the situation will be, yes, our concern is that if he keeps racking up these deficits, that inflation will just continue. Interest rates will stay high. That's going to cause all kinds of misery for Canadians, whether it's their mortgage or small businesses trying to borrow money to expand, to hire. So it is very concerning. But the good news is there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Liberal government put $35 billion into an infrastructure bank that hasn't built a single project. They sent $250 million to the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which is controlled by the communist regime in Beijing, to build the roads and pipelines that Trudeau won't let get built here. So yes, it'll take some hard work, but we know that there's some low-hanging fruit that the government's wasted money on that hasn't actually benefited Canadians, and we can start there.
Yeah, I mean, this is it was interesting when Pierre Poilievre was speaking in his speech last night about cutting waste. Pablo Rodriguez came out and spoke to reporters and said that Pierre Poilievre was a Republican far-right speaker who was talking about cuts. And I mean, I went and looked through the speech, and he did talk about cuts, but he's talking about cutting waste and not cutting programs. But that message to the Liberals and by extension to the media seems to always be a bit distorted. So what is it that you would offer to Canadians that you would cut, that would save money, that wouldn't go after those things that they're kind of fear-mongered into thinking will go away, like the Liberals were talking about seniors' care, for example?
Yeah. Well, when you look at Pierre's speech, he talked about exactly this. We went through, there's something in Ottawa called the public accounts and the main estimates, and they happen in the parliamentary cycle, and the departments have to disclose all their spending. And when you go through there at a fine-tooth comb, you realize this Liberal government has exploded the amount of money that is spent on consultants. So we have a public service, we have highly trained public service that are become experts in their areas of their portfolios, and the government goes along and hires companies like McKinsey to give them advice. Well, we believe that elected officials should take advice from Canadians, and the highly trained professional public service should implement that. We don't need hundreds of millions of dollars on consultants, so we can do things like that. The $54 million Arrive Can app, such a waste of money. Were there a few software programmers, I think they came up with, they determined that you could have come up with that exact same app in a couple of weeks for a few $100,000. When the government sends the signal to the departments that they don't care about balanced budgets, that they don't care about fiscal management, waste happens. It happens organically. People aren't worried about missing a deadline or over-ordering things for the office. So just that sense of, hey, we've got a target to get back to balanced budgets, in and of itself will help address some of the waste.
Well, and anyone who's ever had the misfortune of going through ATIPs, as I have, has seen that every March there always are these just like deluge of invoices for every type of office furniture imaginable, because you've got all these bureaucrats that say, oh my goodness, we were budgeted this much and we don't want to lose it next year, so let's go on a spending spree. And this is never, it's called March Madness, but it's never actually been dealt with by governments. They've just kept keeping this along.
Exactly. And one of the things I like about Pierre's message on this fiscal management thing is how he talks about a dollar for dollar rule, where if a minister comes to the cabinet table with a great idea, we're going to do something, we're going to spend money here or do whatever, he's got to show within his own department where he's going to find the savings for it. We're not going to ask Canadians to pay more taxes, and we're not going to borrow more money to pay for these new types of ideas that will naturally come along. That in and of itself, I believe, will go a long way to ending things like March Madness, because now the minister knows, okay, if I want to do this thing that I believe in, or if I want to go ahead with this program, I've got to get my own department to find the savings. So there's a lot of things that just having that direction from the top will help with. And as I said, some big ticket items, Canada Infrastructure Bank, $35 billion, CBC, $1 billion there. $250 million to the Asian Infrastructure Bank. There's some big ticket items that we can get some, early savings early on, but then there's also just that culture of prudent management that is completely missing from this Liberal government.
Since you bring up CBC, this is something that I think Conservative members is probably not the most relevant issue in terms of impact on lives, but it's probably one of the ones that fires people up the most. And we saw that during the leadership race, and even now I've seen defund the CBC t-shirts out. And this is an issue. I mean, $1 billion is not chump change. And when people look at that, that is actually a very real cost saving. Is your position that how much of that is actually getting cut? What percentage of that? Because I know Pierre Poilievre has talked about saving a little bit for French language programming, for example.
Yeah, French language programming, some issues in northern locations where there's just a completely different set of circumstances. When you look at CBC News in and of itself, it's a lot of money. Big, expensive real estate in major downtown centers. There's a lot of savings there, and they also have an incredibly negative effect on organic Canadian media. When I meet with publishers of local newspapers or even some of the bigger chains, they talk about how they're competing for ad dollars with the CBC, who gets paid by taxpayers' money. So,
and even under C-18, they stand to be the big beneficiary of it.
Yeah. So it's not just costing Canadians to put content that they may or may not like, they may or may not watch. You look at some of the viewership for CBC News is declining. But they're also scooping up some of those precious ad dollars that are the lifeblood of local newspapers, local broadcasters. So it's not just because, we have a philosophical opposition to the state broadcaster and the government running a news outlet. If you can imagine that, we have a situation here in a mature democracy like Canada where the government runs a news outlet. It's not just because of philosophical reasons. There is actually the practical impact it has on stifling that growth and that innovation in local broadcasters, in innovative news media like True North, where there is that competition for subscriptions and for ad revenue. So let's get the government out of that. Let's get the government out of the way, and let's let that grow naturally and organically, and let the free market decide. People who enjoy watching your show will continue to watch it, and you'll have to find innovative ways to attract new audience members as you do. And let's let people like you compete.
Well, I appreciate that. And I'll just ask in closing here, one of the challenges for the Conservative Party has always been that it has, I'd say, a broader coalition than a lot of other parties in Canada. And it has, even just as far as the Conservative base goes, you have your social conservatives, your libertarians, your Republicans, your monarchists, your foreign policy folks, and all of that. And I think it's sometimes a very tenuous coalition. And I think after a loss, the fractures start to show there a bit more. Pierre Poilievre won the leadership on the first ballot by a pretty significant margin. I think your leadership was 13 rounds, if I recall.
And lasted a little bit longer.
Aaron O'Toole, multiple rounds as well, albeit with a smaller field. So do you take from that the party is very unified and all of these factions are playing nicely, so to speak?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm sure you have, but take a random sample of the people who are here. The people who are here at this convention, they represent an excellent cross-section of the membership, because each one of them had to get elected in their local riding association to be a delegate. So this is a great sample of the Conservative movement across the country, and everyone's united. We might disagree, but the thing about Pierre, and the thing that a good Conservative leader will do to avoid that fracturing, is stay true to those core Conservative principles. You and I may disagree on something, but if we agree on freedom of speech, then it doesn't bother me that you advocate for the thing that you believe in. And we can rally around that freedom of speech aspect of it, and then we can have our say and have our debates, have a vote, and live with the results. When you have a government like Justin Trudeau that divides and demonizes people who disagree, people who want to express themselves differently than what Justin Trudeau approves of, then you do see that division, and that's what we're seeing across the country. Justin Trudeau desperately wants to divide people, to think about the divisions within our society and demonize that people don't notice that they can't afford groceries.
Last question. If you get in government, are you going to the World Economic Forum?
Not me. Not just me, but not anybody in a Pierre Poilievre government. We believe that we should listen to Canadians. We don't need to go to fancy soirees with global billionaires. We can go to the barbecues and the Lions clubs and the Kiwanis Club events to hear from Canadians. That's where we'll get our common sense ideas to improve this country.
All right, the barbecue in your local community, not Main Street in Davos. Andrew Scheer, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.